Casting. Thank you for joining us. We will start this webinar 1 minute past the hour. Thank you for joining this webinar. We will be starting 1 minute past the hour. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from the East Coast. My name is Elaine McDonald, and I am the Executive Director of HBS Community Partners, Northern California. I'm pleased to share with you this webinar, Emerging from the Crisis, Planning for the Next Year as a Nonprofit. Before we begin, I'd like to review some housekeeping guidelines for those of you who are less familiar with Zoom webinars. All participants are automatically muted when they join. There are ways for participants to be a part of this interactive webinar. First, please participate in the polls that will be asked during this presentation. Second, click on the chat icon and share your perspectives with either all the attendees plus the panelists or just the panelists. Third, if you have a question for one of our speakers, please click on the Q&A button on your Zoom control bar to submit a question. Time is set aside at the end of the presentation for panelists to answer specific questions. Finally, importantly, this webinar is being recorded and the slides will be available after this session. To give you a little background on HBS Community Partners, we are a nonprofit run by Harvard Business School alumni who wish to volunteer their skills for social good. There are community partners chapters across the nation, and ours in Northern California has been operating for over 30 years. We support over 40 Bay Area nonprofits a year in diverse sectors through pro bono consulting and brainstorming engagements. Because we work with so many nonprofits annually, we do see patterns and trends, and we host events that address these common challenges and opportunities. The impact of the COVID-19 crisis on nonprofits is one of the key topics we have been monitoring. In speaking to numerous social impact organizations recently, I know many have had to make really difficult decisions over these past 4 to 6 weeks to keep their organizations afloat. In many situations, the need for your services in the community is greater than ever, but the ability to serve and to raise the funds necessary to serve is proving to be harder than anything anyone has imagined. And to make things even tougher, the future still remains uncertain. While no one has a crystal ball, one area we do believe HBS Community Partners can help is to provide some frameworks and guidance for how nonprofits can emerge from this crisis and start planning for the next year. The future may be uncertain, but that doesn't mean organizations can't embark on a clear process and path to figuring out how to navigate these uncharted waters. Today, we'll be addressing how you can manage through 2020 by playing defense and offense. We'll also be addressing how to raise funds during these uncertain times, as traditional fundraising dinners and donor parties are risky to bank on in 2020, and getting creative is going to be necessary. At the end of this presentation, we will leave time for Q&A. We hope this webinar will be a useful guide in your journey. Here with us today to talk about these two important topics are Scott Garrell and Seth Shallett, two former CEOs in the for-profit world who have pivoted their careers to serve nonprofits. Scott served as the national board chair of Juma Ventures, led consulting teams for 4 nonprofits in the Bay Area, and is currently an executive coach and advisor working with nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, nonprofit funders, and accelerators, including the East Bay Community Foundation, REDF, and Fast Forward. He is currently supporting several leaders as they navigate the challenges and complexities of the COVID-19 crisis. Seth transitioned to the nonprofit sector a decade ago, serving as the executive director and CEO of several nonprofits, including Prevent Blindness Northern California. He is currently the CEO of Child, Family, and Community Services, Inc. He has also served as a board member and advisor to numerous nonprofits and family foundations, including the Pacific Vision Foundation, Hiller Aviation Museum, Spark, Star Vista, and Women, Inc. I'd now like to hand the mic over to Scott, who will be addressing our first topic, managing through 2020, playing defense and offense.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you everybody for joining today. I know it is an incredibly difficult time out there at the moment. Many of you have had to cancel fundraisers. You've had to move your programs either online or cancel them altogether. You've had to potentially consider drastic cuts that you never would have contemplated and possibly layoffs. You've also had to manage remotely and lead your teams remotely, which is a challenge, and sometimes with kids at home, which just makes it more complicated. This has to be the most challenging time of your lives, but you're in your position for a reason, and your leadership is needed at this time and is critical. From my executive coaching practice for nonprofit leaders and social entrepreneurs, one of the things that I've been seeing over the past few weeks is organizations are now moving from crisis mode and day-to-day fire drills to specifically thinking about living week to week, even month to month, and even what happens throughout 2020. And so today I decided to focus this presentation on how to get through 2020 and manage through 2020 playing defense and offense. And I am a sports fan, so I'm using the sports analogy, but defense, I mean things that you do to survive. Might be cost cutting or unfortunately, furloughing employees. And offense, things that you do to thrive or to grow, new ideas they may be, and hopefully will be on mission. So today we're going to be covering why playing offense and defense is important, a little bit about cash management and making tough decisions, then scenario planning, where you'll be playing defense and offense in this uncertain world, and then playing offense with some new and inspiring ideas we're seeing of organizations which have pivoted rapidly to improve their prospects. What many of you may be feeling now was articulated by Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb. It feels like you're in a house and it's on fire, and you have to both put out the fire while you're rebuilding the house. Well, I was a CEO of technology companies during both the dot-com crash and the Great Recession, and I know how you feel. It's a crazy time, and sometimes really difficult to get out of the day-to-day fire drills to think beyond that and to think about the longer term. But it's really important to be able to do that, and that's what the presentation is about today. So we're going to do a poll here. I've always wanted to do a poll in a webinar, so here we go. And this is really on what % of your time is spent on defense versus offense today. Again, defense are things which are helping you survive, and offense are things that are helping you thrive and grow. So please fill out the survey now.
I see a lot of folks entering their responses. We're going to give another 10 seconds for people to respond. Okay, here are the results.
Okay, thank you, Elaine, for sharing that. So it looks like the bulk is either at 50-50 offense defense or 75-25, which is about where I expected you to be at this point in time. So thank you, Elaine, for the survey. And thank you, everybody, for voting. On to the next slide, please. Okay, So why is playing offense and defense important? Well, this is a Harvard Business School Community Partners presentation, so you'll see lots of content from Harvard Business Review. This was a study done in 2010 by 3 professors. They looked at 4,700 organizations over the past 3 recessions. And what's interesting, what they found is that the best performers following the recession balance between cutting costs to survive today and investing to grow tomorrow. In fact, those companies had a 37% chance or greater chance of improved performance after the recession. Whereas those companies that just played defense, that relied solely on cost cutting and workforce reduction, only had an 11% chance of great performance after the recession. So playing both is important. Okay, Stephen Blank, also in HBR just a few weeks ago, wrote down the survival formula, which is the first part of playing defense. Survival is equal to the speed of your understanding of situation times the magnitude of the pivots or choices that you make times the speed of your time to make those changes. Notice the word speed twice. So really, you've got to quickly figure out. So I'm hearing that my microphone is not clear, so I'll move this a little closer to me. Thank you. Apologies for that. So you need to basically read the situation very quickly, and then beyond that, put things into action. Keep in mind that inaction is a deliberate choice. It actually is a strategy and could have consequences. And please don't be afraid to make tough decisions. As a CEO, I've had times where I have been afraid to make tough decisions and have sometimes paid the consequence by delaying. Because when you do procrastinate, yes, you might feel better for just a moment, but the reality is there's still something you need to deal with. And so if you have a tough decision, please take action and make it happen. Also, in terms of playing defense, cash is king. Many of you have been living in this world, but a best practice that I always tried to do in these situations was, instead of starting top down with your current, let's say 2020 budget and cutting costs from there, my recommendation is what's called zero-based budgeting. Start with nothing and only add back what is essential. You're probably doing many of these things to maximize cash, but delaying payables, delaying rent, talking to your landlord about that, deferring any loan payments, aggressively collecting any revenue, cutting costs where they're not big consequences. Some nonprofits have a credit line. If you do, the best practice is actually to pull on it now because cash is king. And then Seth will be spending 20 minutes later about fundraising broadly, and he has some great ideas to look forward to. The other thing about playing defense is to be strategic when you cut. So you want to trim programs that are not essential to your mission, or ones that have not been effective or lack demand at this time. I always, when I was a CEO, had a few pet projects that might take up 10% of time and resources. But if they're slightly off of the core, now is the time to cut those programs. And you may have done this already. So make reductions in specific areas rather than just across the board peanut butter spreading cuts. Here's a good quote I found from the former CEO of Jive. If you're lean, disciplined, and purposeful, you can achieve amazing things with a smaller group of people on a mission. Focus and you can do great things. Another thing, and probably the toughest part of playing defense, is workforce cost reduction options, and probably one of the more difficult things I've ever gone through. The options are on the left, and you're familiar with freezing hiring. You could reduce benefits. One best practice if you reduce salaries is to make sure you cut the executive team salaries first and most. I know that's difficult. Something I just learned in researching for this webinar is you can get part-time unemployment for people that you reduce to part-time work. So for example, if you had someone work 50% time, they could apply for unemployment and get 50% of what that unemployment would have been if it was a full unemployment. That's available in California and 27 states. If you do furlough people, there's an option to keep paying benefits if you can afford that. And then when you lay off people, please cut so you never have to lay off more than once. I've made this mistake and it is a killer to morale. Even though it's difficult to swallow, please keep this in mind. The other thing that's critical in terms of playing defense, and I'm sure most of you are doing this already, is to lead with your mission, your values, and your heart. Over-communicate with your team with candor, and over-communicate with your team with brutal honesty during this time. But do so in a way that brings empathy and compassion, and also a sense of credible hope, right? Your role is to be the optimist, even in very stressful times. And so there is some pragmatic optimism which is needed. Definitely let your values drive the way that you treat your employees and all you serve, and likewise manage stakeholders for the long term. Ask yourself this important question: how should I act now? And even more importantly, who do I want to be as a leader when this is all over? Okay, we're now going to move into scenario planning in an uncertain world. The goals are to understand how to run your org in a time of uncertainty, how to define success when your long-term strategic plan is on hold, and ultimately to create a range of scenarios and a process to update those regularly. This is not just revising budgets. This is much more of a strategic process than that. So the first step is to identify key uncertainties. That is to say, identify the top 4 or 5 uncertainties that are introduced to you by COVID for the next year. And you want to focus on what you think will have the most profound effect on your organization's prospects and strategies. Include a range from the very big picture of macroeconomic and things that related to public health, down to things concerning your program delivery or your funders or your team itself. Step 2, excuse me, can you back up a slide, please? Thank you. Step 2 is to bucket them into scenarios. So you want to use combinations of outcomes from this uncertainties list to create 3 scenarios: a best case, a worst case, and one in between, and have a plausible combination of outcomes for each scenario. And I recommend to bring these to life, give each scenario a name and a narrative. So for example, a name could be survival, and the narrative is we're doing everything it takes to survive in light of some of the external data. Speaking of data, step 3 then is to craft responses based on data and key trigger points. So what I mean is, for each scenario, define the data that then identify that the version of the world you're describing might be starting to unfold. So an example might be, we are all out of shelter in place, and now that's a version of the world that then would have implications, et cetera. You want to generate responses for each scenario that can drive specific decisions and actions at a more granular level. And keep in mind that if your scenarios describe where the world might be heading, your responses are answering the question, okay, now what? So now we're going to see this in a graph. This is a hypothetical scenario mapping example for an after-school youth services organization. Let's assume they're serving youth on the grounds of a school. On the left side, you have some of the state of the world narrative I was describing and the key data points and triggers. And as you move right, you begin to see what are the actions that you're taking as a result. So let's just go into a couple of these briefly. For the worst case for state of the world, this would be if unfortunately we had to play 1 year of shelter in place ping pong, on and off. And the data we would be reading would see that schools are closed and funding's unclear. And so your game plan is survival. And so what you're doing from a program perspective is you're pivoting to online services only, which I know many of you are doing right now. And unfortunately, you've had to take pretty big cuts on staff and furloughing. Down to the medium case, this is an example where the new normal is you can get back to work and back to school with severe restrictions starting, let's say, July 15th. Schools open in August and you can bring back some funding. And so I titled this game plan Back to Basics. But your program is only very basic programming with broad safety measures and social distancing in place. And here the cuts are less drastic. The people you furloughed are coming back in August. So you get the idea. These are not necessarily all the columns you might use, but might be a good starter guide to making this happen. And your state of the world and your key data and trigger points would probably be longer, particularly the state of the world in terms of the narrative. Then what you want to do is revise, revisit, and repeat. So every 2 to 4 weeks, with the world we're in now and how quickly things change, you want to update your old uncertainties, scenarios, responses, and triggers into a fresh version, and really think hard about what has changed and whether these scenarios are still realistic. And by writing them out in a living, Google document, it's going to force you to recognize what's changing every 2 to 4 weeks. All right, time to play some offense here. So this was a great quote that I found very inspiring. Think about what you can do now that is on mission and will have a lasting impact beyond this moment. Something that helps now is less good than something to help your organization once we get back to normal. So notice mission and lasting impact, and I'm going to show you some great examples of organizations that have already put things into place. So the first couple are examples of organizations that are rapidly pivoting to make a difference on COVID now. The education superhighway that many of you may be familiar with was putting broadband into every school in America. They were just about finished doing that and COVID hit. And so they partnered with another organization to provide Wi-Fi broadband in low-income areas. They literally took old buses and they put them into certain areas and added Wi-Fi equipment. And 30 days from the start of this idea, it's in place in the San Francisco Bay Area, providing school now to tens of thousands of people. Kinvolved used to provide SMS translation for schools and families on just absenteeism. And immediately they said, no, there's so much more we can be doing. And so now they distribute learning materials and info on food programs and health, et cetera. They, in their first week of making this change, doubled their texting and SMS volume. Open IDEO is also doing a business pivot challenge, trying to encourage organizations like yours to come up with the best ideas for pivoting, and they have 5 $10,000 prizes. We're also seeing organizations that are identifying new ways to survive that are on mission, and they help you both now and in the future. So let's start with the Montalvo Arts Center, a beautiful facility down in the Silicon Valley, where they have artists there, concerts, beautiful gardens, etc. Well, obviously with COVID, it has a big impact on their program. And so they're going online, creating and presenting arts digitally. They did their first live stream of arts for Earth Day this week, and they started hashtag social artsolation, which is basically what kind of creativity is inspired while sheltering. Replate is another great organization, which basically historically took food waste. They reduced food waste and food insecurity by redistributing surplus food from businesses like restaurants, et cetera, to nonprofits. Now they've decided to do that and deliver food to homes of those people at risk. So they've gone from just B2B to a B2B and B2C offering. Pretty incredible for both these organizations. One thing also that you should consider is using this time, this opportunity to make your organization stronger. So learn forward in everything you do. Every time there's new data coming in, think about the implications and connect the dots. You want to leverage great team members who have stepped up in this crisis. In my coaching practice, I've been hearing about lots of people who maybe the CEO didn't know was a superstar, and they're showing it, working remotely and helping out in crisis times. And so when you identify those people, recognize them now, but think about how they can make your organization stronger in the long term. Keep an eye out for opportunistic hires. Sadly, there's now 26 million unemployed people in America. So if you have the budget, there is a chance to add other people that could be great or upgrade your team. And then incorporate one new way to lead your organization that you learned since you've been working remotely. So for example, when you start a Zoom meeting, typically people check in with their team for the first 4 or 5 minutes. So now when we go back to the regular world, why don't we start a meeting in person by asking people how they're doing? The other thing that's really important is preparing for a long game. And that means the right pace for you and your team. You need to realize this is a marathon and not a sprint. Sprinters go fast, but they can't run long distance. And I know that's what most of you have been doing, staying up late, working nights and weekends, etc. But it's a marathon. You need to find the right pace for yourself, and you need to feed and water yourself. So that means daily exercise, fresh air, spend time with your family if you are living with them. If not, give them a call on FaceTime. Have time not online, and please get enough sleep. And make it a priority for your team. So Kurt Kruckenberg, who runs the Humane Society of Silicon Valley, started an April sanity competition. Basically, people put in their ideas for how they were going to feed and water themselves, and whoever does the best job wins weekly prizes. So in conclusion, I want to say a couple quick things. One is to make sure that you're playing both defense and offense. Next is this inspiring quote, also from HBR, which says, with imagination, we can do better than merely adapting to the new environment. We can thrive by shaping it. And lastly, what I want to say is that everything in your life that you have done has brought you to this moment, right? You worked hard in college and got your first job and maybe got another degree and you've had several professional jobs, but you are in this current spot for a reason. And that reason is to use your greatness and your leadership to make a difference now. I thank you for all you're doing and for what you are going to do to make the world better as you get through this challenging time.
Thank you, Scott. Seth, would you like to begin? Please unmute yourself, Seth.
Thank you. Unmuted. And Scott, I'll take your baton. And thank you very much. And I think the insights that you provided to us about how to manage the operational piece make a great segue for the second half of our webinar today, which is focusing on raising funds in an uncertain market. And if there's anything I can say with certainty right now, fundraising is most uncertain. Let's look at today's agenda. So I want to cover really three core areas today to give everybody a pulse of what the nonprofit professionals are saying. How bad is it really? And then I want to put, as a second bullet point, a lens that might help people that are struggling in terms of how do I think about pivoting strategically? And I think thinking like an ER doctor has a lot of applicability for the kind of challenges that fundraisers are facing. And then thirdly, I want to focus on what I feel are 5 core areas of revenue that most nonprofits have: special events, individual major donors, programs, in-kind, and foundation grants, and hopefully give you some actionable ideas for each that you can take back. So, how bad is it really? You know, like many of you being sheltered in place, I've had a lot of time to read, and I look at all the nonprofit literature. There's a lot of great surveys out there. And survey says it's bad. In fact, if I had to sort of pick a point of demarcation, I would say from what I'm reading, most nonprofits feel that their revenue in the short term is going to be impacted anywhere from 30 to 50% from what they originally forecasted. And in the longer term, it's less uncertain, but clearly going concern and the ability to survive is certainly on the minds of most nonprofits. The next slide really talks about a survey that came out last week that I think is most interesting, and I want to use a theme to take through the next portions of our webinar. It's by Washburn and McGladrick, and they're a national nonprofit consultancy, and they asked 400 fundraisers what are the top 3 concerns that they have working in the new environment. Concern number 1 is keeping the momentum going virtually, managing their existing fundraising programs from home. Translation, how do I keep the bottom from falling out of my revenue plan? The next bucket was a little under 60%, their ability to adjust, pivot, and change strategies in a volatile market, clearly a top concern. And then finally, just under 50% are very concerned about how they take the practice of engaging volunteers, constituents, and partners, which was done in the obviously physical world, and how do they manage that through a virtual process? We'll share some of these. So the last couple of weeks, as I've been at home with the TV on in the background sometimes, I can't help but be moved and touched by all the stories of the first responders and the ER doctors that are just deluged with all the patients. And one thing that struck me that I think might be an interesting lens is every fundraiser strategic plan is in the emergency room. The plan that you had 60 or 90 days ago is very likely not the plan that's going to get you through the year today. So using that analogy, let's take a look at how thinking like an ER doctor might provide you some inspiration. When a patient comes into the ER, the first thing that people typically do is perform triage. And triage really means assessing the challenges. What are the pain points? What are the biggest areas in terms of fundraising that you see being impacted? If you've got a mix of strategic revenue buckets, major donors, fundraising, it's probably not universally painful across the board. Speak to your constituents, speak to your donors, and check in with your grantors. Then make decisions, but make sure they are informed by data before you move to the next step, which is step 2. Most of us have had the unfortunate experience of going either to the doctor's office or an ER. And obviously, you know, when you go to the ER, the people that have the most urgent situations are seen first, and those that are deemed less urgent, they could wait for many hours sometimes. That's my experience. Think of your fundraising plan the same way. The translation focused on the biggest impact area first. Put your energies into where the highest return on investment opportunities might be. Are there low-hanging fruit opportunities you can address? But shore up those most greatest impact areas first before moving on to other less urgent fundraising activities. Think of it a bit like your inbox. You're deluged by emails every day, but not every email is urgent, and certainly not every email is important. The third step is ER doctors assess the entire patient. They may come in with a presenting symptom, but they'll do a set of labs, they'll do a lot of analysis, and you have to look at your fundraising plan the same way. Completely reassess your plan. What you had on paper 60 or 90 days ago very well may have to be tossed out because it won't get you through the balance of the year. Think of your revenue mix. What resources do you have to work with? And are they the same resources that you had pre-COVID-19? So a quote that I like, that I think is inspirational for me, comes from The Art of War and Sun Tzu. And it says, in the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity. You know, clearly for me, the analogy here is it's a battle for most fundraisers right now, simply just to maintain their plan, let alone make up for significant revenue shortfalls. So for me, there are 4 big questions that I like to ask that kind of guide how I manage through this process. And I want to share those big questions with you, and hopefully you can find some utility in them. Question number 1 is, where are you now? And by that I mean, what are the revenue impacts? Do you have data to show that individual donors are down by 30%? Do you have information about pledges being canceled? Collect the data, understand where you are so that you can make the best pivot to the next point, which is, where do you want to go? Once you understand the challenges that you have to revenue, your anticipated assessments of the shortfalls, it's only then that you can begin to understand, where do I need to go from here? What specific actions do I need to take? What are the sources where my buckets in terms of revenue are leaking the most? And how do I go to shore them up? The third point is about core strategies. And this really gets into the specificity. And for me, I like to visually map out my strategies. You know, pre-COVID-19, fundraisers like to use a term, moves management, and that takes a donor from through the engagement process. Well, what does that look like now that we have to do that virtually? You can't meet somebody. So you have to be able to sort of map out and be able to go from step 1 to step 2 to step 3, which takes us to my 4th point. How do you know when you arrived? And this is really about measurable objectives, right? Pre-COVID-19, fundraisers hopefully were looking at, what are the activities that I need to get to my goal, right? How many prospects do I have? How many suspects do I need to change into prospects? What does my cultivation pipeline look like? If we do grants, what's my grant pipeline look like? Well, now all of that is transitioned to a virtual world, and you have to be able to think through, what are the right metrics in this virtual world? How many Zoom meetings might I have to do? How many new fundraising RFPs might I have to look at? So really, it's about creating a set of measurable objectives that work for you in the new reality. And now it's time for our poll. So I shared with you the pulse of what many fundraisers are saying about their revenue impact. And now I want to ask you, what is your impact? What % of your total annual fundraising revenue do you feel will be impacted by COVID-19 during 2020?
I see the responses just pouring in. We'll give it another 20 seconds. Okay, I think the responses have slowed down. Here are the results.
Survey says, look at that, about 25% to 50%. Looks like the largest bucket. And that's pretty, that aligns with a lot of what I've been reading in the literature. So I think, for lack of a better word, you know, we're all seeing things from the same perspective. But now this will lead us into, I think, the meat of the matter here, which are, let's look at 5 specific revenue buckets And let's take a look at specific actions in each of those areas in terms of ways that we can hopefully stimulate or give you ideas to re-envision these areas for your area. So we'll move on to the first one, which is special events. Now, I think as you look across your fundraising mix, probably the most impacted element of any organization's fundraising immediately is special events. If you had events planned pre-COVID-19 and they were scheduled to take place before this summer, likely those events either will have to be eliminated, canceled, or re-envisioned. So hopefully you've probably had this kind of experience as we see in this video here. Let's move on to some specific ideas around moving from the physical to virtual. This is not an exhaustive list. And in fact, as Elaine referenced in the beginning, we have a pretty rich set of appendices where there's a lot of specific detail and drill down information. But I want to help just some reimagining here. Many nonprofits do a traditional gala. Well, is there an opportunity now to reimagine that and move it more to a virtual environment? Maybe not the entire gala, but as an example, take it table by table and do a special Zoom event for 1 hour with each particular table to share your nonprofit story. Virtual auctions. These are not new, they've been around. Look to where you can leverage them. Flash fundraisers. I have an example coming up right after this slide, but this is a fundraiser that's very specific. It's time delimited. It's looking to raise a specific amount of funds over a specific period. Test it, try those. Create virtual walk runs. I'm seeing a lot of this, particularly in my racing. I like to do a lot of trail running and marathon racing. All of those are canceled, but many of those race companies are moving to virtual runs or walks. How about a virtual program tour? If you're still delivering your services, share your impact with your stakeholders. You can do that very easily virtually. And lastly, just as an idea to think about, is virtual client appreciation nights. It's really important in this environment that we get to appreciate our clients and our stakeholders, perhaps now more than ever. Next slide, please. I just wanted to share a quick example of what I think is a pretty interesting pivot. I read this recently in a board source announcement. CASA is a national nonprofit. They provide services for foster youth. This CASA happens to be based in Pittsburgh, and their special event that was scheduled for April 24th, it produces about 40% of their annual revenue. They quickly decided they needed to cancel that event and postpone it until next year. And they said, let's get creative, and we know we're not going to replace all that revenue. So they went and opted for a virtual walk run. And what's interesting is the Pittsburgh Marathon was scheduled to happen at the same time this event was scheduled to take place. So hopefully they think they can bring in people that wouldn't necessarily be CASA volunteers or CASA contributors with a virtual work run event. Next slide, please. One word about the upcoming Giving Tuesday Now scheduled for May 8th. I think everybody on today's audience is familiar with the Giving Tuesday events that's been happening for the last couple of years, usually in late November or early December. My only comment here is don't feel compelled that you have to participate in this event. You know, there's a lot of strategies and a lot of work that has to go into it. And one of the resources I provided in the appendix is a great document by Campbell and Company, a fundraising consultancy. They ask 3 specific questions that might help you determine whether this event is right for you to participate. It's just around the corner. Next slide, please. Individual major donors. Most nonprofits have some level of individual or major donors. And major donors, that amount varies from one nonprofit to another. But the strategy here is if you're going to ask your donors to make a matching gift challenge. This is an opportunity to scale up the amount, gives you an opportunity to reach out to other stakeholders and get them to collaborate and feel that they can help achieve a significant goal. But one thing I want to stress is if you don't make the match, upfront before the match goes live, ask your donor to even make their contribution if the match isn't released. Next is workplace giving. This has been around for a long time, but with COVID-19, many local companies want to find a way to give back. And I'm seeing an increased use and interest in workplace giving programs. So don't forget to explore this through your volunteers and your stakeholders. Lastly, I think what's most important is board engagement. Like most nonprofit board members, when they agree to be a board member, they sign up and they know that they need to make a contribution. So if that is on the docket for a nonprofit board member, it's okay to ask them to accelerate that contribution if they can, move it forward now. But most importantly, it's really not about driving money from your board members. It's about use this opportunity to engage and collaborate with your board. In my experience, both as a board member and as a CEO working with boards, there's a lot of great ideas. Many board members might have been through similar type of situations. So use this opportunity to build those bonds and get your board members to open up and leverage their networks. Next slide, please. Thank you, perfect. I wanted to share one quick example. Scott used an example also from a wonderful Harvard or Stanford Social Innovation Review article. And I just want to give a quick example of what we're calling a pop-out. Pop-out really is, particularly if you have physical space, there's an opportunity to repurpose that space for a monetization that you never thought of. This is a wonderful example of an organization in the greater Detroit area that was a preschool to career. Obviously, when the shelter in place hit, their school revenue evaporated. They collaborated, reached out to the county, and their facility was set up to be a COVID-19 testing and triage site, and later set up to be an overflow where hospitals could move temporarily their COVID-19 patients. One, this provided great new revenue opportunities, but also deepened the bonds with the local community that might have never heard of the organization before. So it's one example, and you can find more details in the referenced article. I want to think and ask everyone to think about in-kind. Scott touched on this, but be creative about how you view in-kind revenue. Most nonprofits have subscription fees for software, maybe monthly fees. Maybe you pay an email service for email design services. Maybe you have a website designer. There's no reason you can't reach out to them and ask them to accept or provide that as an in-kind donation. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for them to give back, and clearly a way that you can reduce cash out. I just want to share two quick examples. There's a lot more detail on this in the appendix, but here's two quick examples of how corporations are trying to meet nonprofits with their COVID-19 related needs. Logitech has a program where they're giving out free webcams and headsets for K through 12 teachers that now have to reimagine how they teach, virtually. And Cisco is making their WebEx platform, which is a competitor to today's Zoom, also available for free. So get creative and look around. The last area of the 5 buckets is foundations. And I want to ask everyone that has foundation grants in this program today to go back and think about making 5 direct asks from your funder. 1, if you have an existing grant, ask your funders to waive the reporting requirements. That will allow you to focus your time on fundraising activities. Number 2, if your grant is restricted, ask your funders to convert that from a restricted grant to a general operating support grant so that you can put that capital to the best use post-COVID-19. If you've got grants from your funders, ask them to automatically add 1 year. So a current 2-year grant, go back to them and ask them to automatically make it a 3-year grant. Clearly go back to your funders and ask for new unrestricted grant opportunities. And finally, to save time, ask your funders if they would accept a proposal that you wrote for a prior funding opportunity, resubmit and repurpose your work, save time and energy. I think you'll find that many funders are open to this idea. And lastly, don't forget to look locally. Many community foundations, many regional funding initiatives are putting together rapid response grants. Examples here in the Bay Area are the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the East Bay and Marin Community Foundations, Northern California Grant Makers, and Tipping Point. And you can go to numerous websites that you'll find in our appendices. So let's summarize. The only thing that's certain is uncertainty for the balance of the year. Get comfortable in working in an uncertain environment. Focus on the big 4 areas I discussed earlier. Keep your concentration focused on what's going to achieve the best results, but also that will allow you to pivot. Optimize your revenue mix. Pre-COVID-19, perhaps you were 80% dependent on grants. Post-COVID-19, you might find that individual donors or other revenue mixes are the areas that are going to get you the most significant impact. I think most importantly, have empathy. Your donors are going through this with you now too as well. So find new ways to creatively thank them. It's not all about making the ask, but thank them, let them know that you care and you're here for them. And lastly, right, from uncertainty, new ideas emerge. Take this opportunity to test, get creative, think forward, and use this opportunity to build your toolkit so that post-19 you can enhance your own skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seth, and thank you, Scott, for sharing with us your frameworks, suggested action plans, examples of pivots, and creative new ideas to try during these unprecedented times. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and the slides will be distributed after this session. And included in the slides is an appendix with links to an extensive set of recommended articles. We're now going to turn to the Q&A portion of our webinar and address some of the questions submitted by the audience. And our first question goes to Scott. Scott, if you're able to share your video. Thank you, Scott. The first question comes from Alexandra. How can you be brutal and compassionate at the same time?
Thank you, Alexander, for the question. And I may have misspoken. What I meant is I was speaking to the way to communicate with your team and doing that in a way which is very candid. And I said brutally honest. So honest about the situation. Don't hold the facts in. But then as you communicate what's going on, do that with compassion and heart. So for example, we needed to cut 20% of our staff. We were really concerned about making it through the next year. So we needed to do that. And I apologize for doing it. And I have a lot of sensitivity for everybody affected. But this is the last cut we're going to make. And for those that are around, we're going to do this and crush it going forward. So it's a combination of being honest about the facts and doing it with heart.
Okay, this next question goes to you, Seth. This is from April. What is the board's role during a crisis?
Really a fantastic question. And I will say that this crisis is testing all nonprofit boards, right, who are virtually volunteer boards for the most part. They might have their day job that they have to manage, and then they have to manage the organization. So I think the role of the board is to be there as a visible point of contact in the community, right, as a beacon of information, perhaps doing press engagements, being able to share the nonprofit story. But more importantly, I think one of the most effective roles of the board is to build the rapport with the staff, right? Break down the silos that sometimes exist between board and staff members. Use this opportunity to collaborate. Board members often have a lot of expertise from their past lives or their work experiences. Organizations should be able to do virtual webinars. For example, I meet with my board now once a week. We do a 15-minute check-in on Zoom. All board members are invited. We don't always get 100% participation, but it's really a good way that I could stay engaged with the board and that they can share ideas that I can bring to the team.
Thank you, Seth. I'm also seeing a lot of questions, specifically, Seth, about fundraising. And if your live fundraising events, I think Wendy was the first to raise this, has had to disappear, what are some examples of ways of going digital, as well as just the timing of doing that? Did you do that during the crisis, after the crisis has ended? So can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you. And that's really an excellent question that I think really is applicable to virtually all nonprofits. So thank you for asking that. Look, the reality is not every event can be transitioned digitally. Some things don't transfer, and that's okay. And I think in those particular cases, it's okay to reach out to the donors, the participants, the sponsors, and say, look, we tried to reimagine this virtually. We don't think it's the best way to move forward, and we'll reoffer this event when we have further clarity. Having said that, in the digital world, in my experience, sometimes you just have to innovate and test. You might come up with an idea, and at the end of the day, it's new not just for you, but it's new to your stakeholders, right? We're both experiencing these new digital learnings at the same time together. Not everything works. So I think one of the things that I can say is, as part of our appendix, there's a really detailed and excellent list from the Association of Fundraising Professionals and it has a plethora of digital event ideas, ways that you can transition to digital. And I think that would be a real great, more detailed resource to get some ideas that might work for you as well.
Thank you, Seth. Scott, there has been a question from Angel about whether there are any financial process templates available to those to follow that scenario planning advice that you had provided. Additionally, there was someone I think who asked about any key metrics that can be used in creating those scenarios. I know somebody in the chat had posted a link to some financial templates, but Scott, do you have any thoughts about how to do that scenario planning?
I mean, we're happy to send around the framework that I had, and then you can throw it into a Google Sheet and really add in the columns which are most relevant to the factors in your business. And in terms of the metrics, if I'm going to broadly answer the question, I think it is figuring out what are the top 5 to 10 things that drive your organization, and make sure that you are tracking them, what they were a year ago, what they are now, and in your different scenarios, having metrics that then would correspond, that basically would let you know that that state of the world is happening.
This is another question for you, Seth. When should one re-engage with donors, particularly individual donors?
Boy, another great question. And I know this might sound like a squish answer, but the answer is it truly depends, right? You have to do a gut check. There's not one universal answer, but it also depends on what you mean by engagement. Engagement doesn't necessarily have to be asking for money. Engagement can simply be a weekly email update. Hi, this is how we're doing. Here's how we're impacted. How are you doing? So engagement can be anything from as broad as program updates, sharing program success stories, things of that nature. Then you can figure best how to transition to make the ask. I think it's fair to say that most large major donors are probably anticipating that at some point, if not now, they're going to be getting that phone call. So don't be afraid to ask. It's how you ask, and make sure you have an understanding of the person's individual situation. Just as a quick aside, I was talking to somebody last week and they were thinking about calling up one of their major donors. And it turned out that the major donor reached out to them and was sharing a story about the donor's wife actually being hospitalized for COVID-19. Clearly, it was just a timing scenario where the nonprofit CEO found this out before they made the ask. And obviously, in that situation, he deferred making any fundraising asks until some point down the road when hopefully the situation is resolved for the better.
Okay. You might have touched on this already, Seth, because I think this is related to a former question about, some organizations have pushed their gala from April to September, and how likely, do you think that this in-person event can actually take place in the fall of 2020? And, how do you make that decision between switching to a virtual gala versus just keep on pushing it a little bit further, maybe till even next spring, in the hope of being able to meet people in person? How do you suggest organizations evaluate that trade-off of postponing versus just going for it now?
Look, another wonderful and terrific question. And obviously, if I had a crystal ball and knew the future, I'd make future bets on the stock market today. But I think it's a wonderful question. And I think one of the best things is to check with your donors, check with your stakeholders, check with your sponsors, right? Maybe do a flash survey. What do you think if we move forward with this event? And what might that be time frame wise? The reality is you may not have all of the data, and where we're most uncomfortable as humans is in making decisions where we don't have all the data. And the reality is sometimes you have to gather what you can and then make informed decisions. But I wouldn't make any event cancellation decisions unless obviously the event was scheduled for a week or a few weeks post the shelter in place. But don't make them until you take some polls of your donors, your stakeholders, and your sponsors. Get their input. Usually their input would be pretty informative of what your best path forward to answer that question would be.
Okay, Scott, I think I'm going to field this question to you. because it is a little bit about manager organizational talents. How do you manage board participation in the response process, maximizing the value from their talents and their resources while making sure they stay swimming in their lane as board members? So you want to leverage them. I know, Seth, you had mentioned this, really leveraging donors in the fundraising process, but making sure that they just don't start diving into operational and management decisions because it's a crisis. Everybody sort of swoops in and wants to help, from a good place. But, just the management, then the staff becomes just kind of inundated, particularly when some of your board members are oftentimes your most important donors, which is very typical in nonprofits. So Scott, I don't know if you want to take a shot, and how do you manage the different stakeholders within the organization?
Good situation to have. You have a board that is engaged and cares and wants to make things happen. But it starts with you as the leader of the organization, being clear what your strategy is, being clear how you're going to manage the future, and being specific about what you need from each board member. And I think it's okay to say, this is where I need your help. And right now, gosh, I have so many people that want to help in this other area where you keep asking, that I'd really appreciate if you could just stick to this particular lane.
Great. Seth, any other comments on that one? I know you had talked a little bit about board engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. And engagement is really the key. And I think engagement now in this COVID-19 crisis is probably more important than in my last 10 years in the nonprofit sector. I think one of the things you have to do is oftentimes, right, board members that are from a business background, one of the first things they reach to, because it's their strongest skill set, is operations. And I think the question was, what happens if there's a perhaps over-ambitious board member that wants to get involved? Obviously, if you're the CEO, you have to sort of calibrate that with each individual board member. The key is people want to help. So sometimes you have to accept help in a way that maybe you normally wouldn't want to help. So if it's not exactly in your lane what the board member would like to do, but the board member feels that it's their way that they contribute, all I say is be flexible. Don't automatically rule it out, but try to calibrate with them what the best way for their time, energy, and resources to provide input and support would be.
Can I say one more thing about the board really quickly, which is another way to leverage them, so it's related somewhat, is if they're going to give money at the end of the year as part of a give-get, ask them for that money now. If you need cash at this moment, ask them to reach out to their friends and family and for that payment now. That could actually help buy another few weeks of activity.
Great, thank you. There are a couple of questions regarding nonprofits who aren't dealing with the front lines of what may seem like a COVID-19 related crisis. It sounds like their ability to raise funds has sort of been taken in a back burner, and it seems like, as one attendee pointed out, foundations and major donors are definitely focusing on helping their existing donors and organizations that are dealing with the front line of the crisis successfully. So how do new organizations or other organizations that are not on the front line raise funds, especially if they're not a first responder type?
That question
might be for you. Sorry.
Is that to me?
I think that might be best for you to respond to.
And Scott, I think, could add value too as well. So look, that's a really great question. But just because fundraisers, particularly foundations, are focused on their initial grantee portfolio, right? They still have a corpus. They still have money that has to be spent. Most are meeting or exceeding their 5% minimum requirement. So you still need to be able to get in the queue. So I think it's more important now about how you think about what that initial outreach should be. How do you engage initially? If your story or ask isn't related to COVID-19, perhaps it's to say that, look, this too will pass. And once we're beyond the COVID-19 crisis, here's where my organization fits really neatly into the portfolio and mission focus for you. So there's a lot of ways that you can pivot and make what you're doing, if it's not COVID-19 related, still very urgent and important. And I just want to also reflect that in the appendix that I've referenced a few times, there's a document that will specifically answer that question about how to stay relevant, even if you're not a COVID-19 specific organization.
And Scott, I think this is the last question we have time for. Annual employee evaluations and merit raises are due this summer. And following through feels like a good offensive approach, investment, as you had pointed to, but also canceling the effort feels defensive. Can you suggest some criteria to help make this decision regarding handing out merit raises?
I mean, I think that this would be something that would go into a scenario plan, meaning if certain events of the world have happened, and let's say your people are back to work, you're fundraising, you're seeing if you have a social enterprise, you're able to start to generate some revenue and feel like you can afford it, I think you do it. If not, and if you can't do it and you haven't received those signals, this is a place to be brutally honest and radically candid with your team and saying, we would love to do those. We will do them as soon as the budget affords. In fact, if we can make up for it next year by giving double raises, you know, of what it would have been, we're open to it. But in this environment, we need you more than ever, but unfortunately, we're not able to do it.
Got it. Great. Well, thank you, Scott and Seth. We are out of time, but Seth and Scott have graciously offered to email responses to some of the questions we did not get to address live on this webinar. To all of you in our audience, we hope you have found this webinar valuable for your planning and that you have identified some clear next steps. Good luck to you all and stay safe and strong.